EPIC Talks. I'm Caitriona Fitzgerald. I'm EPIC's Interim Associate Director and Policy Director, and I'm so pleased that longtime EPIC Advisory Board member Barbara Simons is joining us today. Barbara is the chair of the Board of Verified Voting. She's the former president of the Association of Computing Machinery, or ACM, the nation's largest computing society, and is one of our country's top experts on electronic voting and election security. She's been on the board of advisors of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission since 2008, and she co-authored the report that led to the cancellation of the Department of Defense's Internet Voting Project in 2004 because of security concerns. She was a member of the National Workshop on Internet Voting convened by President Clinton that conducted one of the first studies of Internet voting and produced a report in 2001. In 2012, she co-authored with Douglas Jones a book about electronic voting machines called Broken Ballots, Will Your Vote Count? She has her PhD in computer science from UC Berkeley and is retired from IBM Research. And I also discovered when putting your bio together that we share a birthday tomorrow. So happy early birthday to us. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Barbara. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you've been promoting paper ballots and raising the alarm about the risks of electronic voting machines for over 2 decades. And prior to the 2016 election, there was kind of this huge shift towards electronic voting machines with no paper record. But the events of recent years have really, I think, shifted public perception around the need for paper ballots. Can you talk a bit about your journey being an advocate for paper ballots and warning against electronic voting machines?
I actually started off in the early 2000s when, I was on the internet. I was on the committee to examine internet voting that Bill Clinton had asked the academies to put together. And I went into that thinking that internet voting was a great idea. You can vote from home, blah, blah, blah. And I came out of it convinced that internet voting would be a disaster mainly for the security reasons, but there are other issues as well. That was the turn of the century. And then a few years later, paperless voting machines suddenly became in vogue. This was in response to Florida 2000 and 2002, with the, you guys may not remember, but older people remember the hanging chads and the pregnant chads and things like that. And so the claim was that these wonderful new computers would eliminate all that. You get your results right away. Election officials really loved it because they push a button, get the results at the end of the day, and they could go home. And the story was that these things are completely secure, and they're easy to use, yada yada yada. Computer scientists saw these as, oh my God, you can't be serious. You're not really thinking about having computers which you cannot check, record, present and record the votes, and there's no way of knowing if there was a software bug or if it was hacked or if some insider got there and changed the results. There's no way to know. So back in 2003, I think it was, Santa Clara County, which is where I was living at the time, was talking about buying these paperless machines. And so I got involved with trying to prevent them from doing so. And I have to say, in those very, very early days, I was brought in by David Dill, another computer scientist who was a Stanford professor at the time. And we thought we would just go and explain to people why this was a bad idea. I mean, we're credentialed, we're computer scientists, we have PhDs, yada, yada. They'll listen to us because we know what we're talking about. They'll do the right thing and we can go home and do other stuff. And that kind of shows how naive we were because that's not the way things happen. And both David Dill and I are still working on this, and it's many, many, many years later. We quickly discovered that we were up against a number of powerful forces, including both vendors and people who felt that paperless voting machines were good for voters with disabilities. The argument being that if you insist on paper, then it was almost as if all voters with disabilities then would be disadvantaged, which of course isn't true at all. And even if a voter with vision problems can't read the paper, it's still possible to produce paper using the computers. and there are ways that voters with vision problems can check it. And finally, I mean, there's this whole question of what kinds of sacrifices are you willing to make to the security of our elections? And we felt very strongly that paperless machines were not a good sacrifice to make. And that's what we've been fighting ever since.
Oh, I wish you weren't still fighting it, but thank goodness you are.
So do I.
How many?
I wish you were too.
How many jurisdictions are still using paperless machines at this point? You know, is it still a huge issue, or are we down to?
I think we're down
a
to
very
6.
limited number. Okay.
I think we're down to 6, but I would really need to check. The way to find out how many places are still using paperless machines is to go to the Verify, which is at verifyvoting.org. You click on the verifier, and it brings up a map of the United States showing the results in 2020, the numbers, and it'll show both at the state and county level what types of machines are being used. So if you go to that map and you see little red squares, those mean that those counties are paperless. Louisiana is entirely paperless. Texas, over a third of the voters in Texas still vote on paperless machines. So in terms of paperless systems that were used in the 2020 election, Louisiana remains entirely paperless direct recording electronic machines. There are some jurisdictions in Kansas, Kentucky, New Jersey, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas that still use paperless machines. Actually, quite a few people, New Jersey has a lot of paperless voting that goes on there. I think that they're in the process of trying to rectify that, but it's kind of shocking that New Jersey still has that. As I say, in Texas, over a third of the voters still vote on paperless voting machines. So that's basically the situation right now. So it's a huge improvement over what it was a few years back, but we still aren't rid of paperless voting. But I mean, just to go back a little bit in history, Georgia was paperless from 2002 to 2018. The election in which Stacey Abrams ran against the then Secretary of State of Georgia was entirely paperless. And there's no way that a recount could have been conducted in 2018 the way it was conducted in 2020. In 2020, they had machines that produced paper ballots. There's a little bit of controversy about those machines, but there were paper ballots, and those paper ballots could be recounted, they could be audited. And that's the first time since almost the turn of the century that Georgia has been able to conduct a recount of their elections. So there are other states. I mean, Pennsylvania, until fairly recently, had a large number of voters voting on paperless machines. So in the 2016 election, it was impossible to check the results in Pennsylvania. Impossible. And that was a pretty key state.
Yeah. Victor, you talked about Georgia, and that was actually my next question. So some states like Georgia have recently purchased voting machines known as ballot marking devices, or BMDs, which were originally designed specifically for voters with disabilities. And these are, I know you know this, but these are electronic voting machines, which then print out basically a receipt that the voter is supposed to double check for accuracy. And verified voting and EPIC have both pushed back against the widespread use of BMDs. Can you talk about why?
Well, actually, those are ballots that get printed out. I mean, so in the 2020 election, those are what were counted.
Oh, and then they were put in the scanner, right?
Yeah. I mean, the printout that the ballot marking device produces, the BMD produces, is the vote. So the BMD, unlike these older paperless machines, does not record the vote internally. So the vote's recorded only on the paper ballot. Although there was
an issue with QR codes or something, right? That the machine was reading the QR codes printed.
Right. So basically what happens is it prints out a paper ballot, although most of these machines print out only the voter's selections, which has caused, for example, voters with disabilities to say that if you force us to vote on these machines and everybody else does hand-marked paper ballots, then it'll be easy to see which votes were cast by voters with disabilities. I think that there's some legitimacy to that argument. There is at least one vendor which produces which has a BMD that prints out a full face ballot with the voter selections marked on the ballot, designed to look as if it was done manually. I'm sure that somebody who examines it closely could determine it was produced by the computer, but it goes a long way to eliminating this concern that if only voters with disabilities or voters with vision problems were using the BMDs to cast their ballots could be easily singled out. So that's, I think, the best solution would be to have hand-marked paper ballots for almost all voters who can use them. These BMDs for voters with disabilities who can't do hand-marked paper ballots, but that produce a ballot that looks almost identical to a hand-marked paper ballot, so as not to cause problems for, to risk the loss of the secret ballot for voters with disabilities. So you mentioned the QR code. Most of these systems do have a QR code that they print on the ballot, which is the encoding of the voter selections, and it is the QR code that is counted, that is tabulated in the scanner, that actually counts these ballots. And a lot of concerns have been raised that voters can't validate these QR codes. Again, I think these are valid concerns that if voters check the printouts to make sure that they're correct, I mean the human readable version, and if there are post-election ballot audits conducted to validate those ballots using the printed version, not the QR version, the human readable portion, I think a lot of those concerns can be overcome. However, it's still the case that these BMDs are much more expensive than hand-marked paper ballot systems. So in both cases with the BMD and the hand-marked paper ballots, you have scanners that tabulate the ballots. And with hand-marked paper ballots, typically the scanners are located in the precinct, and the voter will insert the ballot into the scanner. And if the scanner can actually give feedback if it appears that the voter overvoted, like voted too often, cast too many ballots for a particular race. They also could give feedback if the voter undervoted and didn't vote for a race, but that's typically turned off because voters frequently undervote intentionally. They sometimes will skip races intentionally. And the feeling was that would be too interruptive to constantly tell voters if they've undervoted. But that capacity does exist for most of these systems. So the good news about the feedback is if there's been a stray mark or you mismarked your ballot, the scanner will give you that feedback. You can get a new ballot and recast it. So that's when the scanners are in the precinct. There are also systems where the scanners are centrally located and the ballots are taken to those centrally located scanners. Those tend to be higher speed scanners, can count the ballots faster, but you don't get the feedback for the voter. So with these ballot marking devices, the better ones print out a ballot that is then fed into a separate scanner, just like with the hand-marked paper ballots. There are some that have the scanners internal to the BMDs, and those are really the worst, because in many cases it's not possible for the voter, at least one case, the voter doesn't necessarily get a good view of the ballot or has the option of not checking the ballot, or maybe the ballot might run back under the printer and the printer could make another mark on the ballot without the voter's knowledge. So these are the most insecure forms of BMDs, and in my opinion, they shouldn't be allowed. The only kind of BMDs that I feel would be acceptable are these that have separate scanners, even though that does create problems with voters with mobility issues. There are ways around that, I believe, with privacy shields and privacy envelopes and assistance. So BMDs are controversial to some extent. They're definitely better than paperless voting machines.
You mentioned post-election audits. This was an issue that only election integrity wonks used to talk about, and now everyone knows about election audits. Can you talk about how they work and why they're important?
It's all about the computers. So initially we had these machines that they're called DRE, direct recording electronic machines. Those are the old machines that we're trying to get rid of. Mostly have gotten rid of, but not entirely. That would present the ballot on the screen. The voter would make selections, and then the machine would mark the ballot and store the results and count them. We're getting rid of most of those, but the scanners are still computers, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. So just getting rid of the DREs doesn't get rid of the computers. Even I mean, of course, BMDs are also computers. So the scanners are computers, and the scanners have the same risks that other computers have. They can have software bugs. They could be attacked remotely. So you need to check on the scanners. And the way you check on the scanners is ideally, you've got paper ballots that the voter has verified that have been fed into the scanners. And then you use those ballots as a check on the scanners by using statistics, by randomly selecting ballots or sets of ballots and checking them against what the scanner thinks they say. And the best known audit, basically the gold standard of post-election ballot audits, is called a risk limiting audit. And the way a risk limiting audit works is that it uses statistics to check on the scanners. The goal of a risk limiting audit is simply to either verify or validate the declared results by the scanners, or if enough problems are found, it should result in a total manual recount, which will come up with the correct result. The goal is not to get the exact number. That would be much harder. That would basically require a hand count. And it also doesn't check on whether or not the voters check their ballots to begin with. So all it does is, given a set of ballots and given the results that the scanner claims those ballots produce, did the scanner produce the correct results?
Do you think we'll see a shift to vote by mail after last year?
Well, I do think a shift is happening. I have mixed feelings about vote by mail. Obviously, it's important, especially for voters who are unable to get to the polls, or for whom it's difficult. It's important when there's a pandemic. There are certain advantages to vote by mail. You can vote from, you have plenty of time to ponder your decisions and so on. Concerns about vote by mail are, first of all, you don't get this nice feedback you would get if you go to the polls, fill out your ballot and put it through a scanner locally, and it'll tell you if you've made a mistake. With a vote by mail ballot, if you've made a mistake, you don't get the feedback. You also have to worry about the ballot things being properly signed, the envelope and so on, that you follow all the rules. Many states allow voters to cure their ballots if there's an issue. So that means you can go back and fix problems, like if you put the wrong date on the envelope, or you forgot to sign your name or something like that. Many states will contact you if there's time and give you an opportunity to fix the mistake. Some states don't do that, and sometimes there isn't time. Obviously, vote by mail also depends on the Postal Service working well. And there is always the issue of voter coercion and vote buying. You have to weigh these against the convenience of vote by mail and what seems to be the case, that it increases voter participation. So it's a trade-off, like most things in life are. So vote by mail definitely has some very positive things to it, but there are also some negatives. You have to worry about, for example, an employer gathering the employees together and saying, let's have a ballot marking party here. And, you know who I favor. Right. Stuff like that. So, I'm not saying that happens or would happen very often. And again, of course, with the pandemic, people aren't gathering much anyway.
Yeah, it's a perfect test case, right? One last question for you. So EPIC has long advocated, not only for election security and work to do on, electronic voting machine cases, but also voter privacy. A lot of what we're talking about with secret ballots and the like. So, what do you see as the next big issue when it comes to voter privacy? Is it these voter registration databases that states, there are public records in some states, or is it this vote by mail issue? What do you think?
Well, obviously, vote by mail has issues, but there's another area that we haven't really discussed yet, and that's internet voting. And there are privacy issues there too. And one of my big concerns going forward is that there could be a push. There is, in fact, a push for internet voting. The claim being that, again, with something like a pandemic, it makes it easier to vote. You can vote remotely. The argument is made that military overseas can't get their ballots in on time, and voters overseas can't. Although the MOVE Act was passed some years back that requires states to make blank ballots available online for voters overseas so they can download the ballot, fill it out, and then mail it back. So that basically cuts the transportation time by half because you don't have to get the ballot sent to you. And military voters also have the opportunity to have their mail facilitated, to have expedited return of their mail. So, but these arguments are trotted out anyway. And then on top of that, you have a big push in certain areas, among certain people, for what's called mobile voting, which is just basically voting on your smartphone. And one of the companies pushing mobile voting even claims that it's not internet voting. But of course, as we all know, when you use your smartphone, you're going over the internet. So, and then they say, well, but we have voter verified paper ballots because after we get the ballots at the election officials' end, you can print out the ballots. Oh, they say you can do recounts because we print out the ballots from the election officials' location, and you can do audits on those things and recounts. And of course, there's no way of knowing if those particular ballots that were sent out over the internet were hacked or not. So it's in no way a guarantee, but these are the kinds of arguments that are made. And people who don't understand how computers work, they might buy into them. Or they might just feel that the convenience of it is worth it, or they're willing to make the sacrifice that, well, okay, maybe the election could be hacked, but I want to be able to vote. And to my way of thinking, what you really want is you want everybody to be able to vote and not worry about the election being hacked.
Is there anything I didn't ask you want to talk about? Or so, you touched on internet voting, but if you want to say more about that, we all, I think, hope that after experience the last 2 elections that people would say, you know what, you guys were right. Internet voting is a crazy idea, but sounds like maybe that's not the case. Huh?
I mean, yeah, you would think that after this major attack that was made by Russia, and we're still finding out how serious it was, right, that people would say, you got to be kidding. But I don't know. It seems that people's brains can have 2 contradictory ideas simultaneously. At least that's been my experience. So, and I'm probably guilty of that too. But I've certainly seen that with internet voting, that people think internet voting should be great, even though they see all these hacks that are constantly being exposed.
What can groups like EPIC do to push back against that?
That's a good question. I think education is an important thing. I think we all have to work on that, and certainly that's an area where verified voting and EPIC could work together. Reaching out to policymakers. One of the things that I worry about with mobile voting is that the proponents tend to have links to Democratic Party. And I think that there will be people who are very concerned about voter disenfranchisement, legitimately so, but who might view mobile voting or internet voting as a way around that. And that concerns me. I think that's something that has to be addressed.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. This has been so informative. We really appreciate you chatting with us today, and so appreciate the work you do to protect our elections.
Thank you. I appreciate the work you do.